With Hoorman Soil Health Services. We're going to be doing a presentation today on getting started with cover crops. Just to give you a little background about myself, I was a county extension educator with Ohio State University for 24 years. And then I worked for the USDA NRCS as a soil health specialist for 3 years. And I just recently started my own business, Hoorman Soil Health Services. So again, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the different cover crop species and how you can get started to improve your soil health by using cover crops. Okay, so here's an overview. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the summer or warm season cover crops first. Then we'll talk about the winter or cool season cover crops. Then we'll get into different species, some of the brassicas, the radish, the kale, the rape. We'll go over some of the grasses, the oats, the cereal rye, the sorghum Sudan. We'll also briefly cover annual ryegrass. And then there's a whole slew of legumes. The Valencia is a new one, crimson clover, hairy vetch, winter peas. Some of the more exotic ones, the sun hemp, the red clover, and the sweet clover. And then we'll talk briefly at the end about cover crop mixture. So that's what we'll be covering in about the next hour. So this was put out by Burley, North Dakota, the NRCS there. They came up with this cover crop periodic chart. Looks a lot like the periodic chart for different elements. And the way you read this is on the left-hand side, we have the cool season. On the right-hand side, we have the warm season. And so on each end, we have the grasses. In the middle, we have some of the broadleaves, which include the brassicas and the legumes. And then right there in the middle, we got mainly the legumes, and included in the legumes are the clovers. Really, clovers and legumes are separate, but they're not exactly the same. But clovers is a separate variety, but a lot of times we just lump those together. So, as you look at this, what are some of the grasses that are cool season? So we got the barley, the oats, the ryegrass, the wheat, cereal rye, triticale, annual fescue. That just means if I say cool season or cold, that they'll survive the winter. Then we have on the right-hand side, we have things that with the first frost are going to die. So pearl millet, foxtail millet, proso millet, a lot of the sorghum Sudan grasses. There's a lot of different ones in there, the grain sorghum, corn, and even teff. Teff's kind of a really nice, it's almost like Timothy. It's a 1-year crop that some people will put in after a drought. It doesn't require a lot of moisture. And then in the middle, we've got some of the cool season broadleaves, Phacelia that came from France. I don't use a lot of it. It's kind of expensive. If you're going to use Phacelia, do it later. Flax is one that's highly mycorrhizal, so some folks are starting to put that in. The spinach, the kale, the canola, and the mustards, okay, are some of them there. Then we also have kind of in that group the turnips, the radish. Beets is one that if you get a chance, try to put beets in a mixture. The reason we say that is there's some recent research that shows that there's about 5 major species, and beet happens to be in that really greatly enhance microbial action in the soil, the amount of microbes. So beets might be one that could be missing that could really bring you up to a higher level. And then carrots. And of course, we have all the legumes, the field peas, the winter peas, the cowpeas. Well, cowpeas would be a warm season. That's over a little bit further. The cool season ones, the red clover, the white clovers, the sweet clovers, the Valencia. We don't have that on this chart, but that's kind of a newer one. We'll talk about that one. And then obviously some of the warm season ones that we have there too. So with that, we'll kind of move on and get into a few of these. When we're looking at diversity, you really need to have one of each. We at least want to have a grass, a legume, and a brassica out there. Buckwheat and sunflower are kind of in the other category. Those are also good. But you really do want to have a diversity. Why do we want that diversity? Well, we can keep the nutrients recycling. We can keep the We can increase having live roots year round. And each one of them has its own special function. So on the warm season, though, the ones that we use the most, we don't use a lot of, there is alfalfa out there that's a 1 year. Don't use that too much, but cowpeas, sun hemp's a little more expensive. But cowpeas, they're bigger seeded, but you can get up to 150 to 200 pounds of nitrogen out of the cowpeas. The sun hemp will put on nodules that are as big as your thumb. Soybeans is kind of in that legume. It makes its own nitrogen. But then we got other broadleafs like the buckwheat, the sunflower, and the safflower. All those are good broadleafs. What about warm season grasses? Well, corn. The big ones that we use generally are the pearl millet, the sorghum, the Sudans. Those are going to be the ones. Teff if you're needing it for forage. We want when we're using these warm season, these are all going to be planted probably after wheat or late in the summer. You could possibly put them after corn silage, but it's getting pretty late. Most of these need at least 60 to 90 days of growth in order to get it. So you're probably going to do it after wheat, or if you have a crop that comes off, maybe like oats or something like that to put them. We also have cool season grasses. The big ones are the barley, the oats. The winter rye is probably the standby cereal rye, the triticale. Some folks are using the annual ryegrass. It's very popular in Indiana and Illinois. For some reason around Ohio, Michigan, we have a little harder time raising the annual ryegrass. If you do raise annual ryegrass, get one that has a waxy leaf. We have some cold winds that come out and really desiccate those. So you got to find one that will survive the winter and do quite well with you. On the cool season, radishes are common, the kale, the rape. Rape is just a wild cousin to the canola. And so those are all good. If you're grazing, you might use the turnips. And then the legumes, winter peas or field peas. The winter pea, true winter pea, will plant in September. A lot of people are using the Austrian field pea, and those are planted usually the 1st of August, first part of September. They're going to die out, but the field pea will actually give you more nitrogen than the winter pea. The reason being is they're going to bloom or kind of almost finish their life cycle, and that's when they put on their nitrogen, right when they start to bloom. So they'll die out, and you'll get maybe 150 pounds of nitrogen, whereas the winter pea maybe get 75 pounds. They'll just start to come up. They'll survive the winter. Then they have to grow. So you want to plant green into those. And then the hairy vetch is very popular. We're starting to do a little work with the sweet clover. I probably should have bolded the Valencia, the crimson, and the red. Those are all very common clovers. The Valencia can tolerate wet feet, puts on a lot of nitrogen. It has a hollow stem, and we're finding that one is really starting to become good for forage, but also for nitrogen. It has a huge, huge leaf. The crimson clover, sometimes it doesn't do quite as well. It may not survive the winter quite as well, but it doesn't take a lot of seed for those. The seed's all very small, and it's not just too expensive, so that's why a lot of people do it. We're looking for diversity above and below ground. Feeding the soil biology is very important, and we want to have a lot of different types of roots. So here's where we dug a trench, and you can go down and see roots even 4 or 5 feet deep in the soil, and you can see tap roots and fibrous roots. That's what we're looking for on diversity. Ideally, we would like to have one in each category: a cool season grass, a warm season grass. We'd like to have a cool season broadleaf and a warm season broadleaf. We might even try to throw in, with those broadleafs, at least one legume and maybe at least one brassica, and just to make sure that we have a lot of diversity. You can even throw in some other ones like the buckwheat and the sunflower. Here's just a mixture just to show how some of these can complement each other. This is Sudan grass and cowpeas growing together. This was planted right after wheat harvest, and the legume is going to supply nitrogen to the corn, and the Sudan grass, and the Sudan grass actually supplies phosphorus to the legume. So they both complement each other. Also, look at the height. One's tall growing, going to get sunlight from high up, whereas one's lower growing and it's going to get that low level light. And they actually have different root systems, so they're not competing for the same nutrients or for water. So that's why these mixtures really give us a lot more biomass. We have a lot of different types of cover crops. So we got the legumes, the grasses, and the brassicas. What are the legumes good for? Well, mainly nitrogen. They have a low carbon to nitrogen ratio, generally tap roots, although some can be quite fibrous. We're going to talk mainly about the cowpeas, the Austrian winter peas, hairy vetch, red and sweet clover, the sun hemp, lupins, lentils, soybeans. We'll also discuss a little bit of the Valencia with that. With the grasses, what's good about the grasses, they have very fine roots. They add a lot of carbon. They have a much higher carbon to nitrogen ratio. It really depends on the killing date, though. The longer you let them grow, the more carbon you'll get. But you got to weigh that against can you get the next crop planted. So oats, wheat, cereal, rye. I don't like wheat as a cover crop because it has some of the same disease properties, diseases as what our corn does. Annual ryegrass has a ton of roots. Sometimes it can be a little harder to manage. So you got to be careful with the annual ryegrass. Barley's becoming popular. And then the sorghum Sudan is actually one of my favorites. We'll talk about that, and then the millets. On the brassicas, they're really good for weed control, surface compaction. We're talking mainly the radish, the turnips, the kale, and the rake. And so there's a number of them. Let's start with the brassicas, the radish. They're very fast growing. This is probably one of the most popular in conjunction with the cereal rye. They're very high in moisture. They'll freeze out and die at about 15 degrees Fahrenheit. They absorb, somewhere around 5 to 5.3% nitrogen. They're a real hog for nitrogen. But one of the problems is when they die out, they got a big hole in the ground. And I like to say it turns into elephant snot. But you got to be careful, because once you create that hole, if we get any rain or snow melt, a lot of those nutrients can be leached out. So if you're going to raise radishes, we recommend you do it in a mixture. And probably you don't need more than 2 pounds. We used to raise them at 8 to 9 pounds. They'd get about like a pencil, but then they would die out. They compete with each other. So it's about like alfalfa. You really don't need a lot of seed out there. They're about $3 to $3.50 a pound, somewhere around there. You don't need to put out more than what you need, and we really don't want them to dominate, and they can dominate. So 2 pounds is plenty, usually in a field. They do release a natural fumigant and a natural weed suppressant chemical as they decompose, glucinate, and that's why you won't see very many weeds wherever you have radish. They're very good at taking out compaction. They do smell bad, though. It smells like propane, a gas. Some people say it smells like a dirty diaper, especially when they start to decompose at temperatures above 50 degrees. So if we get a warming spell in the summer, in the winter, you may have a nasty smell for a couple of days until either the temperatures go down and they freeze, or until they fully decompose. So be aware of that. Here's an example. You don't have to have radishes this big. This was taken in 2008, but that was back when we thought radishes should be as big as we can get them. Actually, the smaller ones are just as good, but believe it or not, what you're looking at is only 50% of the root. It has very, very tiny hair roots on it that go out in the soil, and those tiny hair roots add a lot of sugars and really stimulate the microbes in the soil. So it can be very beneficial. When we're looking at cover crop radishes, what are the disadvantages? You don't want to sow them too early because they can potentially reseed. You can't go too late. They need at least 6 to 7 weeks of growth for best results. In Michigan, I would say you need to plant them sometime in August or September. Hard seed may come up in the spring. They're pretty easy to kill. And if we get a winter like some winters where it doesn't get real cold, you may have to kill them in the spring. Again, they're fairly easy to kill. They do smell. A lot of times we'll get a warming spell and after they've been frozen, and they do not smell very good. I will tell you that. Advantages: very deep, large, penetrating tuber, enhances soil percolation, usually reduces soil compaction. The earthworms just absolutely love them. And they are a voracious scavenger of nutrients. However, they don't hang on to them very long. So it's a great place to plant corn in the spring. However, a lot of the nutrients have already been lost. If we get a lot of rain, it can be washed away, and you can graze them. A lot of farmers will graze them. They like them on butter bread. I have a lot of guys that they are quite sweet, and there even are markets now for the Daikon radish, the white radish. This is Daikon radish. They really help with soil compaction. I've got a slide here that shows that where we had an open field versus where we had the radish field, it decreased compaction by greater than 40%. Okay, so they are quite beneficial. Where we've applied manure to the Daikon radish, you can see that they take up quite a bit of nitrogen. So the yellow bars are the decrease in the soil concentration of nitrates. So we're getting an 80% decrease where we put these radishes compared to bare soil. So they are doing a very good job, and it didn't matter whether it was dairy, poultry, sludge, or swine. It was pretty much across the board. They're very good. The real question, though, is how many of those nutrients are going to be available in the spring. That's going to depend on the weather a lot. And you'll have a lot more nutrients available in the spring if you put another live cover crop that has live roots in there. They'll recycle the nutrients for you and carry those nutrients forward. So it is really important. Just another test done at Ohio State where we had no cover. The average soil concentration was 21 parts per million versus where we had the oilseed radish, the soil concentration of nitrogen in that soil was 6.5. So they were doing a very good job of tying up the nitrogen nitrate in the soil. Here's just the picture, shows radishes and peas, winter peas planted in alternating strips. Some guys are taking their planters and with the splitter, they'll put peas, in the back and put the radishes in the front, and you can plant these in alternating rows. Generally, they'll try to plant right on top of the radish. It'll be about 3 to 5 degrees warmer sometimes. And then those roots can reach out and get the nitrogen from the peas that are there. So winter peas are very good at putting on nitrogen. We can get up to 150 pounds of nitrogen out of them if they're grown early. Usually those are the peas, Austrian winter peas that are planted in, say, August or very early September. If you wait too long, if you're planting a true winter pea, and it only gets 2 to 4 inches, you may get 75 pounds, but you have to leave it grow and bloom in the spring. So we would recommend planting green into that. They're very easy to terminate. Just actually the act of planting will kill a lot of them. So they're not very hard. This is what they look like in the spring after they've been terminated. The oilseed radish and the winter peas, you can see some of the radish carcasses laying there, and you can see some of the holes. People worry, will my seed go down to China? Generally, the ground's so mellow that you can just plant right through that. It doesn't matter whether you plant right on top of it, right beside it, or right in between the row. Usually the ground's very mellow. We've seen very few problems with that. We also have kale and rape. Rape usually is dwarf exit, has a very fibrous root system, has a pretty high crude protein content, 15 to 25%. It's good for forage. Needs to be planted just a little bit earlier than kale. Kale can be planted a little bit later. Probably kale is the one that we can plant the latest next to cereal rye. Cereal rye can be planted almost any month of the year. Cereal rye originated in Siberia, so it's used to cold weather. But to get the best results, you probably want to plant your kale probably no later than mid-October. Maybe the third week in October, just depends on the weather. You got to have, again, about 30 to 60 days minimum. It'd be better to have 60 to 90 days of growth to get the best use out of that. Kale seed is cold tolerant. It can reach 25 degrees or 25 inches tall. You can graze it till December, January, and it's also good for wildlife. So I think I have a couple pictures. This was a solid stand of kale. And kale and rape look an awful lot alike. They're hard to tell apart, but you don't have to use very much. 3 to 5 pounds per acre for a solid stand is all you need. If you're going to put it in a mixture, you're probably going to use just quarter pounds of it, depending on how many mixtures you've got in there. So we'll talk about how to do that later. Here's the rape, the dwarf exit. It also gets quite thick, puts on a beautiful flower in the spring. If you want to get noticed, this is a beautiful one, very, very nice flower. What about the grasses? Can be a great pollinator. Well, for the grasses, they provide carbon. We accumulate nitrogen and phosphorus. They'll take that up. They provide phosphorus to your legumes. They're very good at reducing the horizontal soil compaction versus the vertical. A taproot will go down vertically, where these will spread out horizontally. The fibrous roots also protect the soil and prevent soil erosion, and it provides habitat and food for our microbes. It really helps to promote good soil structure because they've got a lot of root exudates that are great. Oats, there's a lot of different types of oat. There's the spring oats. Those are the normal ones. We have a winter oats now that I'm really becoming quite interested in. They'll get down, not into the single digits, but if you're in the teens, they'll probably be fine. If you get much below single digits, they'll die out. The black oats, those came from South America. They don't maybe as much tolerate the cold, but great root system. What I like about the oats is they're highly mycorrhizal, and then we even have forage oats now, so you can put out a special type of oats if you want to graze. Great for erosion control, scavenge a lot of nitrogen, grow a very deep fibrous root mass. Again, the mycorrhizal, probably nothing better than oats for improving mycorrhizal growth, getting a lot of species diversification out there. They're quick to establish, relatively inexpensive. They can be broadcast lightly and lightly tilled in, or they can be added with other cover crops to add additional value. And you can also use them for forage. So it's pretty easy to control. Generally, you can just drill them in. You can put them in 1/2 inch to 1.5 inches. Rates will vary depending on the variety. And also, you got to be careful if you're getting money from the government. They may not pay for oats if it winter kills. So you're going to have to be a little bit careful there, just depending on what program you're in. Oats, here's some oats that were planted August 3rd. I always like to put this one in because we learned some things about oats. About 10 years ago, we were doing research with oats, and we had 3 totally different results. So the first year we planted oats, and they got planted a little bit later. They didn't get quite as tall, and they died out. And the following year, we got 5 to 10 bushel yield increase in corn. The next year, we planted them a little earlier, and they got up into the boot stage, and we didn't see any increase in the corn yield that year. But we did have good soil structure, and it did help with the mycorrhiza. Third year, we decided to plant them even earlier, and they kind of got like these. They got into the head stage. That year, we had a 5 to 10% yield decrease on the corn. Now, why would you expect a 5 to 10% yield decrease? That's because we're getting more lignin into that oat crop, and when that starts to decompose, it's going to suck nitrogen away from your corn. So you want to make sure that you get your oats terminated before they get too much past the boot stage. At the boot stage, they make really good forage, and the cattle and the sheep just go nuts over oat hay. So you can take that off, feed it. Remember, we're after the roots that are in the ground, so you can get the benefit. There's nothing wrong with harvesting oats. Just make sure you don't harvest them too low, leave a little bit of residue on the soil surface, and you'll be fine. Benefits of oats versus disadvantages. Disadvantages, bin run oats can have wheat seed in them. They'll winter kill. Advantages, they're really good at taking up nitrogen. They have a deep fibrous root system. You can aerially apply them. They make excellent forage, and good or bad, they winter kill, most of them. Now, we do have some winter oats now that some folks are starting to replace those with winter oats with cereal rye, taking the cereal rye out, putting the winter oats in. Reason they're doing that is because of the mycorrhizae. It's very good on your mycorrhizae fungi. Here's an example where we used a high boy application and went over the top of the corn. This was put on at the end of July. This picture was taken in the drought year on August the 28th. And you can see there that I had a pretty good stand of oats. Generally, it's better if you want to use corn varieties, you might have to either try to get an upright corn variety so that it gets a little sunshine down there and you'll have better stands. If you get a real tall growing, thick corn crop, you may not be able to get your cover crop to grow. Winter rye, cereal rye, these are good. The disadvantages, they can have an allelopathic effect. So you got to be a little careful if you're going to plant corn into that. You've been long-term no-till and you got a lot of nitrogen or manure in your system, you won't have any problem. We have found out that there's probably 60, 70 different varieties of winter rye. Some of them have more of an allelopathic effect than others. Try to find the one that doesn't have quite as allelopathic effect. And there is some information in research that can help you with that. It can sometimes get away from you in the spring. It can be a little more difficult to kill. Generally, we like to plant standing green into that, and then you can roll it with the crop roller, or you can terminate it with the spray. Advantages, if you planted later than any cover crop and has the greatest opportunity to seed, it'll grow just about any month out of the year, as long as it's got moisture. It germinates at 32 degrees. The problem is you may not get a whole lot of growth, so it may not come up till spring. So planting it earlier is better. Generally, we can plant October, even into November or December, but you'll get your best results if you plant it a little bit earlier. That works well with aerial application, has a good rooting depth. It'll go down 30 inches. Excellent winter hardiness, probably the most winter hardy of any of the cover crops we've got. Does scavenge a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus. And a lot of folks like to use it in vegetable production for tomatoes, pumpkins, watermelon, muskmelon, cucumbers, all those things. So it is a very common cover crop, probably our most popular cover crop. Advantages, you can graze it. You can get up to 4 to 6 tons of haylage off of that. Had a dairy farmer that has learned a lot about winter rye, had 200 cows, 200 acres. He got rid of all his alfalfa and just started going corn silage with cereal rye. And he got 2 crops instead of 1. Also, he put 8,000 gallons of dairy manure on in the fall. He'd have about 12% crude protein. If he put another 8,000 gallons of dairy manure on in the spring, then harvest that, he'd get up to 19% crude protein. So you can get a lot of good haylage off of that. He feeds that to both his dry cows, his heifers, and his dairy cows, and his components and his yields are up. So again, just remember, it can have some allelopathic effect that can be good for weed control. But if you're going to plant corn into that, you better make sure you got enough either manure or nitrogen there. You're going to need at least 40 to 60 pounds of nitrogen put on at planting to help that overcome some of the cereal rye and the lignin from the roots in the soil. It is excellent before soybeans. We get about a 5 to 7 bushel yield increase. The reason being is it's supplying phosphorus to those soybeans. It's also keeping the weeds down. It has an allelopathic effect on the weeds, doesn't hurt the soybeans. It also takes out soybean cyst nematode and Phytophthora and Rhizoctonia in soybeans. So that's where we get that 5 to 7 bushel yield increase. And the ryegrass, some folks like to plant that. Disadvantage, it can be probably the hardest to manage, the most difficult to kill. If you're going to kill it, you either want to kill it early before it joints, or you wait until it's already out of the boot stage or in the boot and starting to form a head. Then it's very easy, because then when you spray it with the herbicide, it will take up the herbicide. But there's a time period there where between the time it joints to the time that it's in the boot stage that it just doesn't take in herbicides very well. If you're going to spray it on days where the nights are getting warmer. You really want to spray it between about 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. Use flat fan nozzles, which have a very fine mist. Make sure you use the right gallonage with that, and make sure you have your pH is low enough. Generally, you'll be okay. You got to be careful that you don't put something in there that's going to tie up. Usually, we're using Roundup. You don't want to add atrazine or anything else to that, because it just doesn't work as well. So there are some newer winter hardy varieties that are available. They're very deep and fibrous root mass. Probably the biggest amount of root, probably 50% more roots than cereal rye. Excellent scavenger of nitrogen. Again, works well with aerial application. You can make forage out of it, but you will have to wet bale it. It will not dry. It's got that waxy layer on it. It will mold before it will dry. Best time to plant it is early August through early September. Make sure you put on enough pounds. Plant only one variety. Do not plant a mixture. The reason we say that is generally if you plant a three-way mixture, one's going to die out, one's going to grow like crazy, and one's going to be half dead, half alive. The one that's half dead, half alive, when you try to kill it, that's the one that's going to become a weed for you. So make sure you only buy one variety. It's a lot easier to manage it. It'll keep you out of trouble so that you don't have it going to seed for you. Winter barley is also used. We can actually harvest that. Makes an excellent feed. It's for haylage, but also if you want to take it for grain, it can be substituted 1-for-1 with corn. It comes off up to 2 weeks earlier at harvest than wheat, so you can double crop soybeans if you wanted to. It uses less nitrogen. It's an excellent scavenger of nitrogen. We're also starting to get into malted barley. And sometimes if you can't sell it for malted barley, some of that barley then is sold as a cover crop. It's more tolerant of low fertility. It is a little less winter hardy than rye. And, generally you need a little bit higher seeding rates, but you can put that down 3/4 of an inch to 1.5 inches. One of my favorite ones is the sorghum Sudan grass. Plant that at a 1/2 inch to 1.5 inches. It looks an awful lot like corn. Sorghum Sudan grass, if you let it get about 3 feet tall, you need to either mow it or take a cutting early. You can feed that to your cattle, even sheep. But when you take a cutting, make sure you leave about 6-8 inches or a foot. And what that'll do is it'll grow out faster and it'll put on 5 to 10 times more roots. You'll have a great soil structure. It really takes out soil compaction. It's probably our best soil compaction fighter, but just remember it's going to die with the first frost. So pearl millet can also be put in after wheat. It has a real pretty head. You can even sell those at the farm markets. Some people sell them for $1 a piece, but it adds some biodiversity to our soil. A lot of people like the buckwheat. The buckwheat is very pretty. It's got a lot of pollinators. The bees absolutely love it. One thing, you do not want to be in a buckwheat field after 4 p.m. because at 4 p.m. the flowers start to close. They open up at 9, they close at 4, somewhere around then. And when they close, the bees get a little ticked off, so you might get buzzed on there. So buckwheat, there's a special market for buckwheat honey. They're a great pollinator. They're great for surface compaction. So we like to put those in there. You can actually get 2 crops of buckwheat in 1 year because it's very fast. Within 45 days, it puts on seed. And it does make phosphorus more available in your soil. If you have a field that's low in phosphorus, put in some buckwheat, it'll make the phosphorus more available. Then on the left-hand side, we have the beautiful sunflower. Very deep-rooted, helps with deep compaction. Also another great pollinator. If you go out in the fall, you'll just see tons and tons of insects on there. They're getting their nectar from that sunflower. I often see about 20 to 30 different pollinators out there, bugs that I don't normally get to see in late September, early October, right before the frost. And it's a great one. It really does increase your soil health having sunflower out there. When we talk about legumes and clovers, they make nitrogen with the help of the bacteria that provide nitrogen to the grasses. They have a longer, typically deeper tap roots, although some of them can be quite fibrous. They help us with that vertical compaction. They're going to recycle the phosphorus and the potassium. They are lacking phosphorus a lot of times, and so if you put that with the grass can supply phosphorus to them, and that will help with nitrogen. But they do acidify the soil, and they have a lot less root mass. So you have to be careful that you have a mixture. These are probably the most common ones. The crimson clover has been quite popular. A new one is this Valencia. Look how big that leaf is. It will actually vine out, can be 14 feet long. You can take a hay cutting and then plant corn into it. Red clover is a standby that's been around a long time. The problem with the red clover is a lot of times the nitrogen doesn't come available till later in the growing season, but it does tolerate wet soils. So does the Valencia. And then the cowpea. Cowpea is a summer annual. it will die out. You can put it in after wheat. Doesn't take a whole lot of moisture. Only takes about an inch to get it to germinate or less. But it can put on 150 pounds of nitrogen for a corn crop next year. So all good cover crops. Just a little bit more on the Valencia, very high biomass, great for foraging, get up to 3 to 5 tons. The crude protein is 22 to 28%. Relative feed value is 277. A lot of dairy guys in the Northeast, Vermont, Pennsylvania, New York are using Valencia. It has a hollow stem, tolerates flooding. And it's not a soybean cyst nematode host. So it can grow 3 to 14 feet. It has a yellow flower, very deep tap root. Doesn't take very much. If you're going to do it for hay production, do it at 8 pounds. You can drill the seed in at 4 to 5 pounds an acre and look at the biomass there. It's just tremendous. Very shallow seeding, though. You don't want to put it in too deep. Crimson clover, disadvantage is we've had some winter kill with it. You really got to get it started a little bit earlier maybe. And sometimes it can be a little difficult to kill in the spring. It really needs to grow until about May 1st. That's when these beautiful crimson flowers come out. It's just absolutely gorgeous, but that will maximize nitrogen. Generally, when you let cover crops grow and they bloom, when they're just starting to bloom, that's when you maximize your nitrogen production. You can get up to 140 pounds of nitrogen within 90 days following wheat. The earthworms love it, and we've got some a little bit more winter hardy varieties are now available. Hairy vetch is one that it likes little drier soils or hilltops. Again, high biomass. You can have several inches that you can plant right into plant green. It'll suppress the weeds, puts on a lot of nitrogen, 200 pounds of nitrogen. The problem with hairy vetch is it has hard seed. So if you're going to plant wheat, you want to make sure that it's kind of like morning glory. It'll wrap on your combine. So you want to be careful if you're going to go to wheat. It's really great for soil compaction. It does need well-drained soils. It can grow 3 to 7 feet. Has a purple flower. You're going to broadcast that at about 18 to 20 some pounds, or drill it at 15 to 20. Okay, and you want to put that in at about a ½ inch to 1.5 inches. Here's sweet clover. This is one that I really like. I've done a little research on this. I had a farmer tell me a story. Back in 1970, they had sweet clover out. 71, 72, don't remember the exact year. Had a very wet spring. They couldn't get it harvested. They didn't know what to do, so they just mowed it off. And they no-tilled corn into that. They got 190 bushel corn in 1972, I believe it was. So that'd be like 250, 270 bushel corn. It has a tremendous tap root, 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre, but it is a biannual. It does tolerate a little bit flooding or wet feet. Excellent pollen. You can get excellent honey off of this. It doesn't take a lot of seed, but you don't want to plant it too deep. I planted some of this, and if you get it too deep, you won't get a stand. It's excellent as a soil builder. Just remember, though, it's just like hairy vetch. It has hard seeds. So once you have sweet clover, you'll always have sweet clover. It takes many, many years to get rid of it. But it is really good at breaking up the soil and making it better. Here's some Austrian winter peas. Compared to the Canadian field pea, they're really just about the same thing. The difference is the Austrian winter peas are not as winter hardy. Generally, they're planted in August or September. The Canadian or the true winter peas or field peas, they're planted a little bit later in September. Again, the difference in nitrogen is Austrian winter peas are 150 pounds versus 75. The winter peas you got to allow to grow in the spring to get that. Disadvantages versus advantages. It's best to get them, they're big seeded, so you need to get them incorporated. You don't necessarily have to do tillage, but you can put them in with the planter. They generally winter kill. There's some years they will survive, especially if you get a true winter pea. Well, these are the Austrian winter peas, so generally they do winter kill. Need at least 5 to 6 weeks of growth to get best results, and you're only going to graze them once if you decide to do that. Advantages: a lot of nitrogen, they're easy to kill, and they really do help your soil. Here's Dave Brandt. He's an Ohio no-till farmer, and he's about 6'4". You can see how big they get. That's a lot of nitrogen. All the nitrogen is in the stems and in the leaves. And when it rains, it's a slow release of nitrogen to your corn plot. Legumes, we got this hemp. Crotalaria is what they call it in South America, but this is sun hemp. It doesn't take a lot of seed, but the seed is expensive. You're going to have to plant it because it's a summer annual. You're going to have to plant it in July. I actually planted some on my farm in 2012. Unfortunately, it stayed very dry. I was hoping to get seed production off of it. That was in the early days, and it got 15 feet tall, but this was in October, and so we mowed it down. But you can see how big the nodules get. As big as your thumb, it'll put on 200 pounds of nitrogen. Matter of fact, in South America, they plant sun hemp into their corn, in between the corn. They'll plant the corn, wait about a week, plant the sun hemp. The two will grow together. The sun hemp will grow above the corn. They'll harvest the sun hemp above the corn. Then they'll turn around and harvest the corn, and that's their sole source of nitrogen. Haven't been as successful doing that in the United States. They get a little more moisture than what we do. Here's a typical crop rotation with minimal nitrogen input. You plant wheat. After that, plant cowpeas or maybe a multi-species mix. Plant your corn. After the corn, plant rye. After the rye, put in an early soybean. And after the early soybean, you can go back to wheat. And that's a very standard rotation that a lot of people are doing. You get enough nitrogen off the cowpeas to feed that corn, 150 pounds, get it planted. So here's cowpeas. We got 138 to 152. Most of that nitrogen is in the shoot, and in the leaves, only about 9 to 10% of it's actually in the root. So this is research done at Ohio State University. And this is some of that corn. That corn in the back has had 0 nitrogen, but it all came from the cowpeas. So you can see that you can grow some pretty good corn just by using the cover crops. Now, you might not get that every year, but take a PSNT test and see how much nitrogen you have out there. Here's Bill Richards. This was his farm. He uses the winter peas for slug control. He no-tills corn into the winter peas. The slugs like the winter peas. They don't really like the corn, but if there's nothing else to eat, they'll eat the corn. By the time they get done decomposing the winter peas, the corn has outgrown the slugs, and now you have slug poop, which is going to fertilize your corn. So it's kind of a nice system. Not that you want to have a lot of excess slugs out there, but the winter peas can be used as a trap crop for slugs. Planting legumes and cover crops, make sure you have a good crop rotation. Time of planting is critical, especially on the legumes. You got to inoculate them. Generally, if we plant early is better, and we always get better results where we drill it versus broadcasting, because we just want to get that seed to soil contact. Okay. Now I've got a little bit on inoculating, because a lot of people will buy inoculated seed. The rhizobia bacteria inoculants are crucial to allowing legumes to fix these large amounts of nitrogen. You've got to have the correct amount. So make sure you look at the species. If you don't have the right background of bacteria in the soil, then you need to inoculate. So for each one has a little bit different one, and what you use on soybeans, you're not going to be able to use on alfalfa. So a lot of times people are pre-inoculating them, but we're finding out that those inoculants don't last very long. Okay, Rhizobium that inoculated alfalfa can survive on the seed for greater than 2 years, but in many other cases, the other strains only survive less than maybe 24 to 48 hours. So beware of pre-inoculated seed. It's always best to inoculate it at planting time. So here's some more information. So alfalfa red clover can go up to 2 years. Peat-based planter box products, maximum 48 hours. Crimson clover, 48 hours. Hairy vetch, 12 to 24. Winter peas, 12 to 24. So again, clovers, you're probably 48 hours. If you've had inoculant that's been stored in a bag, you don't know if it's exposed to sunlight, that will kill it. Also, if it gets too warm, you really want to keep the temperature below 50, keep it stored in a refrigerator. You'll have a lot better results. If you're not getting nodules, it's because you didn't have the right inoculant or the inoculant was ineffective. Inoculants, cover crop legumes, For maximum nitrogen production, it's recommended to add fresh inoculant at seeding time. I generally like to buy 2 different inoculants from 2 different companies and put on twice which each company recommends. It's pretty hard to overdo it on the inoculant, and the inoculant's fairly cheap. If you really want the nitrogen for nitrogen production, that's the best thing. And just remember, each strain has each type of cover crop has a little bit different strain. So one thing you can get, this is a link inoculant. It's easy to apply. It's pretty effective. It has a lot of the different inoculants in there. If you're doing it in cover crop mixtures, this is great. If you're doing just one species, you might want to just buy the one that you need, but you can get some of these other ones started. If you do it for a number of years, you may eventually reach a point where you may not need the inoculant, but we have found at Ohio State, some of the research that's done on soybeans is that it actually pays to even inoculate soybeans every year because you get 1 to 2 bushel more yield. So it can be done. Just remember the carbon to nitrogen ratio is very important. Things like rye and wheat straw have a very high carbon to nitrogen ratio. They're going to decompose slowly, whereas your legumes are going to decompose much faster because they have a low carbon to nitrogen ratio. Kind of right in the middle is the ideal microbial diet, somewhere around that 20 to 24 to 25 to 1. And so just realize that there can be some differences there on how fast things are going to recycle. What fits after corn and soybean? The toolbox is wide open. I'm sorry, it's not quite as full as what it would be after wheat. After wheat, we can plant almost anything, but after corn and soybeans, sometimes we may have to do aerial application. Timing and moisture can be a concern. So what fits after corn and soybeans, you're somewhat limited, especially on time. Try to plant earlier maturing corn and soybean varieties if you can. A lot of people think that they're hurting yield. Yield in corn and soybeans is dependent on moisture at pollination. You plant an early maturing corn variety early, and it gets pollinated early, you can get just as good a yield as what you can with the late maturing corn varieties. Drilling a lot of times is best just because you get a little bit better stand. What species work best after corn and soybeans? Cereal rye, oats, annual ryegrass, crimson clover, the Valencia, and any of the brassicas, the radish, turnip, kale, and rape, or any of the mixtures. You don't want to plant a warm season cover crop after these because you don't have time for them to grow. After wheat, the toolbox is wide open. You can do it for forage production, for nutrients, for nitrogen, for building soil organic matter. Just be careful you don't plant some of them too early because you can get some of them will go to seed and you'll have weeds. We're coming to the end here. We're going to talk about mixtures. Here's a common 3-way mix: oats, radish, and crimson clover. The oats is a summer annual, kind of in that summer annual. It's kind of also a cool season, but it's going to die in early winter. It adds carbon, improves water infiltration, highly mycorrhizal. So it's pretty good. The radish is a summer annual. It will die out also. It accumulates nutrients. It's good for soil compaction, keeps the weeds down. It fumigates the soil. It helps with water infiltration. So, and then the crimson clover, this will be the one that will survive. Or you might try the Valencia. The Valencia is becoming more popular. A good nitrogen source, stabilizes the soil organic matter, permanent cover, and it's an early pollinator. So that's why we like to do a 3-way mix. Radish, oats, crimson clover, they're easy to manage because 2 of them die out. You only have to manage 1. If you would decide to put in cereal rye, now you have a problem because then you have to decide when to terminate it. They're both the legume, the crimson clover, or let's say the Valencia, you might want to leave those grow later, but the cereal rye, you might want to terminate that earlier. So now you got to figure out which one you're going to maximize. So it can be a little more difficult. You want to watch which ones that you mix together, especially if you're doing some of these different mixtures. Okay, so 10-way mixture. Here's a more complicated. We've got a little bit of everything. We have buckwheat, which is a summer annual, a sunflower, summer annual, cowpeas, and radish are both summer annual. We put in some sorghum for carbon. The radish is a brassica. The cowpeas is for nitrogen. Cereal rye is going to give us carbon, and now we got some brassicas in there, the kale and the radish, but it's a winter annual, so you're going to have to kill it in the spring. And crimson clover is another winter annual, and then red clover. So there's a lot of nice things in there. There's some pollinators, just a whole bunch of different roots, a lot of different things. It really helps to promote soil health with that 10-way mixture. A lot of different combinations can really be used to grow and address a lot of different resource concerns that you might have: erosion, nutrient loss, improving diversity, trying to get improve your soil health. It really does, though, increase your resiliency, and we do see a lot of benefits from planting into these 10-way mixes. Here's all the 4 principles. We just want to reiterate these. These are the 4 principles from the USDA NRCS. Minimize your soil disturbance, maximize your soil cover, maximize biodiversity, and provide a continuous living root. Okay, so that's going to wrap it up here. Just a summary: plant a diversity of cover crops if at all possible, including warm season and cool season plants. That would include some of your brassicas, your daikon radish, your kale, and your rape. You've got grasses. You can go with the oats, the cereal rye, the sorghum Sudan. Wheat can be used, but don't like to see wheat in there because wheat has a lot of the same diseases as corn. We've got a lot of different types of oats out there now, and annual ryegrass could also be added to that list as long as you know how to manage it. Then we have a whole slew of legumes: your winter peas, your crimson clover, your Valencia, the red clover, sweet clover, sun hemp, and the hairy vetch. Sun hemp is a little more expensive. If you're trying to keep your budget down, generally go with the Valencia. It's only 4 pounds, 4 to 5 pounds the acre. It's $2.50 a pound. Very cheap, but you get a lot of nitrogen out of it. And then just remember to use the right inoculants on the legumes. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. If you need to get a hold of me, go back to the first slide. You can email me or send me a text, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.